Good morning. This is the first of two videos that I've made for this week. This one concerns only Conrad and the secret sharer. Here's a couple of pictures of Joseph Conrad. This is a younger picture of him over on the left, and then a later picture done in 1912, as you can see, with his wife and son. He had two children altogether. Conrad was a sea captain. He was Polish, was raised in Poland, ran away to sea after the death of his family, and spent 20 years actually as a sailor, rising to the rank of master in the British merchant service. The Secret Sharer, the story that we're going to read, was published in 1912, and it's one of many stories that Conrad wrote that's based on his experiences as a merchant captain. He only commanded two ships. One was the bark Otago in 1888, 1889, and it that plied the same waters pretty much as we see in the Secret Sharer. He commanded one other boat, the Roi des Belges, a small river boat in the Congo before this, and that became the basis for his greatest story, Heart of Darkness. There's a true story that lies behind the Secret Sharer. There was a mate named Samuel Smith on the Cutty Sark, which was another clipper ship like the Otago. I'll show you some pictures in a minute, who killed a sailor in 1880. He was allowed to escape from his ship by the ship's captain. He swam ashore, was later captured, and served 2 years in prison for manslaughter. Interestingly enough, after that, he was then rehired as a mate and went on to complete a career in the merchant service. Here's a picture of Conrad's ship, the Otago. You can see it's a sailing ship. It's not a powered ship or steam-powered ship in the way that we might think. The ship in the Secret Sharer is also a sailing ship, and so Conrad was a master sailor. He was really very good at that kind of stuff, and so he speaks from his own experience when he writes. Here's another view of the Otago, another drawing from the period. This comes from the National Library of Australia. The ship itself, they think, is a wreck on the island of Tasmania. That after many years after Conrad left the ship, it was bought by another company and was in the timber trade, and eventually wrecked in a storm. There's a picture of the Cutty Sark. I have two of those, and the Cutty Sark is a museum ship in London. This gives you a little bit of an idea of just how large these ships are and how complicated. And when you see all the rigging and the mast and the sails and things, it gives you an idea of just exactly what Conrad's talking about in the Secret Sharer. Here's another view of the Cutty Sark. I've been to this several times when I was a kid. I lived in England in the early 60s and went to London frequently, and I've been to the Cutty Sark probably half a dozen times. You can get an idea here for the scale of this. Here's the people standing on the pier. These are normal-sized humans, let's say 6 feet tall, and you get an idea of how big the ship is. It's big in some ways and very small in others. This would have been a little larger than the ship that Conrad talks about in the Secret Sharer, but it would have been rigged the same way, 3 masts, 3 or 4 sails in each mast, and you can see how complicated it would be to operate. In the story, one of the first features that we see is the Pak Nam Pagoda. This is a Buddhist temple that's in the city of Bangkok, the capital of Thailand. And the story begins with the ship coming out of the port at Bangkok, actually the port of Satahip. And this is the most prominent feature. It lies behind them, and it was used as a navigation aid by the sailors who came in and out of the port. This is the area here that the story takes place in. You can see Bangkok up here at the head of the Gulf of Thailand, or at the time that Conrad was writing, called the Gulf of Siam. And here is the island Chain off the coast of Cambodia, where this particular story takes place. And most of this takes place on the island of Koh Rong. And that is here. You can see it's a small green island. The mountains that Conrad talks about in the story are at this end. You can see the terrain is higher at one end than it is at the other. I couldn't find a picture exactly of what the island looks like. I do have one later that might help you with this. But at least this gives you an idea of where they are. It's the second largest island off the coast of Cambodia. What I didn't know until this morning when I was putting this together is that the current season of Survivor was filmed on the island that Conrad's ship comes up next to in the Secret Sharer. And this just gives you a little bit of an idea what the island looks like. You can see the rocks, the shallow beaches and things that the island is famous for, but it also gives you an idea of how dangerous it is to bring a sailing ship in here at night when you don't really have a good idea of what the bottom looks like or what the depth under the keel is. And so the ship's captain in the Secret Sharer is taking a tremendous risk. I think this is the island of Koh Rong here in the distance, and you can see the mountain that Conrad talks about from this angle. His ship would have been on the other side of this, and where there's a steep drop off, and then there's some shallows and a lot of rock. So what he was doing was a very dangerous thing. Just to give you an idea, here's the current cast of this Survivor, which I've never seen. And this gives you an idea of just how complicated it is to film an episode of The Survivor. If you can imagine this little island and you've got 5 or 6 different cameramen here just filming one scene. So this might give you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at. In the story, there's some points of concern with me, and you might be interested in the same kinds of things. Immediately, when the young man comes on board, Legat, the captain believes him. He trusts him implicitly. They're the same size, they may be about the same age, they can wear the same clothes, they look remarkably similar. And almost from the moment that the man comes on board, the captain says he believes him. And I always wonder why that is, why the decision is so fast, why on the basis of hardly any information except for the mate's story, the captain decides to believe him. At one point, Legat mentions that his father is a parson. He's a preacher, a minister, and an Anglican church person. So I always wonder whether that's important or not. Throughout the story, both the ship's captains and Legat are always worried about the law. They're always worried about what's going to happen when they go ashore and who's going to sit in judgment on them and things like that. And what this kind of reminds me of is this blind application of law in The Guest, in the Camus story that we're reading in the same week. And I always wonder if there's a connection between those two things, that in these isolated kinds of communities, a ship, the desert, the idea that law, which is always far away, it's at some remove from where the action of the story takes place, seems to affect the judgment and the actions of many of the characters. A fourth thing to think about in the story is the differences in age between the captain who tells us the story, his mate, who's chief mate, who's much older, and the captain of the Sephora, who's also older. The captain who narrates the story in The Secret Share, I think, is a very young man who gets this position because the old captain dies, and he has to take over the ship. He's young, he's inexperienced, but he's got the qualifications that the chief mate does not. And so you always get the sense that there's some kind of tension here between the young man who's the ship's captain and the older men who were present on the ship, and the older man who's the commander of the Sephora. And of course, there's also the question of age being almost identical in the story between the captain, who narrator, and Legat. Legat, we find out in the story, is about 25. The fifth question that I always have is, the captain takes a real risk in trying to hide him. He hides him throughout the story, and he does all kinds of strange things. But the most important thing that he does is he takes his ship almost to the point of having it run aground, which is like the worst thing a sailor can ever do, ever, in order to give the sharer, Legat, a chance at escape. And it works out okay, but there's always a little voice in the back of my head that says, I wonder what the captain would do if it hadn't worked. Point number 6 here, is Legat a ghost? On page 186 in our version of the text, this is a question that the captain raises, and he says, is Legat a ghost? Am I the only person who sees him? And one of the questions that you might want to think about as you're reading the story is, does Legat become less and less real, less and less corporeal as the story goes on? He's described exactly as a ruddy youth and looking just like the captain and healthy and everything at the beginning of the story. Another point in the story, he's leaning over the table, and the captain says he looks like a convict with his close-cropped head, dark head. And then we get this ghost line a few pages later. So there's almost like 3 different stages where the reality of Legat, and then Legat as a convict, and then Legat as a ghost as we go on in the end. And then we see him disappear at the end of the story when Conrad calls him a proud swimmer. And so there's a really interesting shift in there, but I'm not quite sure what the pattern is. So I'm hoping that you would notice that, and maybe some of you would comment on that either in one of your papers or in a blog posting. Lastly, and something else we're seeing in here is the same thing we see in The Guest. These are both stories of all male worlds. There's no women. There are men who do domestic tasks, like we see the steward doing stewardy things. You know, he's cleaning, he's dusting, he's cooking, he's serving the captain and the officers. That's his job. But he's acting in kind of a female sort of capacity, if you want to think about it in those terms. But there's no there's no women, there's no sexual component in here, although many people have looked at the relationship between Legat and the captain. When they're talking, they're always in bed, as being something that perhaps we ought to take a look at. I don't tend to focus on that very much, but that's just a question of taste, I guess. But the idea here of these all men, all isolated, we see everybody in the story in a pretty elemental way. At the same time, there's these very strict rules, and the captain talks about this. There's ways that the captain has to conduct himself. There's ways that the crew expect him to act. And so all that's very important to him as a way of establishing and maintaining his authority as the ship's captain. And just as he hazards his ship, he also hazards his authority as the captain. And this is an unforgiving male world. There's nobody who's going to take his side and say, oh, the captain didn't really mean to do that. So the stakes are high in this, and the stakes are high in part because of the isolation of the ship and the crew from land, from the structures that govern it outside of what we might call, the internal workings of the ship. So it's a very dangerous place for everybody. Even the mate's story, Legat's story about killing a sailor, gives you an idea that there's one set of rules for land and one set of rules on the water. And when those two collide, they collide in some pretty profoundly unhappy ways. So I look forward to your discussion board postings. I look forward to your paper if you decide to write about this particular story for the next written assignment. And I hope you enjoy it.